our marriage is dead.
That's
paano po
entirely
yan?
unfortunate, although I do not comprehend how that can happen as a normal course of procedure. If a couple are determined to stay married, principally for the sake of the children, who after all are one of the basic objectives of the marital status, the bringing into life of children and bringing them up in the proper Christian way. This will not happen because basically marital security is attitudinal. If you have the right attitudes, you can stay married no matter what the obstacles are.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's turn over now to Tato. Tato, do you have any questions?
Well, I'm a married man, Mrs. Santiago.
You look it.
And kakatuwa yung mga bata nga talaga. But as a husband, what would you see the role of husbands in your life? So your husband, how would you see his part in your personal and public life?
I look on my husband first as an individual human being like myself. He has needs and wants. He has longings that for which he seeks fulfillment. It is therefore my duty as a wife to assist my husband in order that he can realize himself, realize his potentials. So I do not think of my husband as an object or even as a subject. I think of him as a human being like myself who needs help on many occasions, and I must be prepared to give this help.
Well, hindi ako Filipino macho, no? Pero I guess even in our Christian upbringing, we learn about the role of the husband in terms of upbringing, leading the family, both not just financially but also spiritually. How do you see that in your relationship?
That's entirely correct, and I concur with your statement. The husband plays a pivotal role. First of all, he is a role model for the children, particularly if they are males like himself. And secondly, he plays a basic role of spiritual leadership in the family. He is the natural spiritual leader together with the wife. This is a leadership that they co-share. And so it's very important that the husband must set a good example.
Mrs. Santiago, if you do become president of the Philippines, what role would your husband play in terms of advising you politically or involvement in your own government service?
My husband, if I became president, would immediately make a quantum leap to anonymity. In other words, he will be reduced to the level of the peripheral. Because, you see, I cannot allow my husband to bend my mind, for otherwise people will try to use him as a conduit to obtain what they cannot obtain from me directly.
Yes.
That would be an impossible situation, and it would militate against good government.
Is this something that you've discussed together?
Oh,
and
yes,
talked about?
definitely.
I see.
In fact, not only before I proclaimed my presidential candidacy, but at the moment of our marriage, we discussed my career. I told my husband, I cited Ecclesiastes. I told him, there's a time to agree with me and a time to agree with me.
Either yes or yes. Okay. Ito naman, tinig ng kabataan. Francis, ikaw naman.
I have one particular question. I'd like to go back to the point raised a while back regarding, well, the reasons why you opted to seek the presidency. Let's put it the other way around. In terms of perhaps the impact or the effect on your family and on your own life, what would be a reason for you to not to seek the presidency as of this point?
The sheer limitations of time. There's not enough time to both run a country and run a family properly. So obviously, I'll have to mitigate the attention that I can devote to one or the other. In this case, my family is prepared to make the sacrifice.
Which means, therefore, that as far as your family is concerned, it will not be a hindrance or an obstacle to your seeking the presidency?
No, definitely not, because they understand as Christians what it is that I feel is my mission in a Christian life.
Would there be any other personal considerations that would make you change your mind or make you realize that perhaps the presidency is not, well, as of this point in time, the goal or the objective?
No, nothing, because I feel that this is God's will for me. I might be mistaken in my perception, but I have tried very hard to avoid the pitfalls of self-delusion. And therefore, if God calls, I must hear and I must obey.
Mrs. Santiago, I think as Filipinos and as Christians, we put a large value on family life. On the other hand, we've seen a weakness in that oftentimes family members can take advantage of another's political position or power. Could you comment on this, on how you would relate to that? Family members, maybe not immediate family, but relatives and relatives of relatives, using your position in order to enrich themselves or to gain power as well for themselves.
No relative of mine within the legally prescribed degrees shall ever be allowed to influence, participate, or otherwise derive undue benefits from my government post. In other words, I would prohibit those relatives within the degrees described by the rules of court from even holding public office, except for one person, my brother, who is already in the Armed Forces of the Philippines. He's a graduate of the Philippine Military Academy, and apparently upon graduation, a PMayor is required by contract to serve his government. Thereafter, apparently the military it becomes the only career path for him until a certain age. So for that reason, I'd have to exempt him from this prohibition.
Right. Have you had experiences in the past where as a regional trial judge, for example, where someone close to you or related to you had broken the law and you had to come in and implement the law to go beyond the family relationship?
No, this did not happen. And also, even if it did, hypothetically, I would have had to obey the rules of court provision that I had an ethical obligation to inhibit myself.
I see.
I would have inhibited myself.
Right. Well, thank you again. Well, it's time for us to take another break. We've got to go back to some of our commercials. Sabi nga, we do need the daily bread that's provided for us by God. And we'll take another peek, this time at Miriam's public life. We'll go behind the scenes and interview some of those that she's worked with before. Nakakatakot pala, Miriam, magtrabaho ng kasama mo sa CID o sa Department of Agrarian Reform. Sabi nga ng mga ibang co-employees mo doon. But let's go back to some of our earlier questions that were brought up. When we discuss family life, one of the issues often raised is media, especially with its emphasis on sex and violence and the quality of shows. Napakalaking impact niyan sa buhay ng mga bata o sa buhay ng mga magulang o sa family relationships nila. And there's a lot of concern today about having clean, decent media. What's your stand on this?
That will go to the question of press censorship. And you know that the courts are ultra-sensitive about these questions. They are forever preserving the domain of what is called free speech or free expression. So I'm afraid that if the thrust of present efforts is to restore or reinstate censorship in some form or other, it will fail judicially. If it were brought to the Supreme Court and questioned, the Supreme Court will rule that it would be unconstitutional to limit input into the living room of any electronic media. In my case, I think that auto-limitation would be the best method of regulating exposure, especially of young children, to media that might be full of sex or of violence. What I do is I call my 10-year-old and my 20-year-old and explain to them that sex and violence cannot conceivably deliver any benefit to them, and I leave it to them to censor themselves, for I cannot forever be in the living room or even in my house. I'm always out of the house or out of the country. And I am very happy to tell you that the system has worked so far.
Yeah, where would you draw the line then on what comes into the home from a legal perspective? Are you saying that just totally free speech about anything or any values would be allowed to be presented publicly? Where would you draw the line there?
Let me point out that the Constitution is couched in absolute terms. It makes no exceptions. It says, no law